Welcome to the Deep Call Movement Bible Study. And tonight we're going to talk about from the wilderness to the promise. And tonight we're going to walk through something foundational. We're going to look at how God provides in different seasons, the relationship between faith, trust, and obedience, and why provision requires a response, not just prayer. Because if we misunderstand provision, we will mishandle what God gives. We'll be talking about the background scripture from Exodus 16, 14 to 30 through 31. And also in Exodus 16 and 4, God told Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. But in Exodus 16, he didn't just give the provisions. He gave instructions with the provision. He tested them. They were told, gather only what you need for one day. Do not store it overnight. And on the sixth day, gather double. Do not go out on the Sabbath because that's a day of rest and worship for him. Now, here's what happened after he gave them provisions and gave them instruction. Some gathered more than they were told, and it spoiled. Some still went out on the Sabbath, even though they already had enough. So God's response in Exodus 16 and 28 was this: how long will you refuse to keep my commandments? How long? This wasn't about food. This was about obedience. God gave them everything they needed, but they didn't trust his instructions. They believed he could provide, but they didn't trust him to keep providing. Just because you pray doesn't mean you trust God, because trust shows up in how you follow God's instructions. The issue was trust. Let's ask the question, why take more than you need? Why go looking when you already have enough? It wasn't a lack of provision. It was a lack of trust. Fear of not having enough for tomorrow. A desire to feel in control, maybe. Holding on instead of relying on God daily. When you don't trust God's provisions, you'll try to secure what he already promised. What does that look like? Let me tell you. It looks like trying to hold on to more than God told you to hold on to. It looks like trying to figure out tomorrow when God only gave you instructions for this day. That's what it looks like. Now, planning is not the issue. It's okay to plan, but the question is, whose plan is it? Is it God's plan or is it ours? Because there is a difference between planning with God and planning instead of God. Planning with God follows his instructions, moves at his timing, stays within what he said. Planning without God adds extra just in case, moves ahead of his instructions, and is driven by fear, not faith. God already had given them a plan. He said, take what you need. Don't store it. Trust me for tomorrow. But they created their own plan. Let me gather more just in case. Their problem wasn't a lack of provision. It was replacing God's plan with their own. Because when we don't fully trust God, we don't stop believing. We just start adjusting. And every adjustment outside of God's instructions creates a burden that he never asked us to carry. It's okay to plan, but whose plan is it? When you don't trust God's provision, it's like doing extra, not because God says so, but because you don't feel safe with what he provided. When trust is missing, you overgather, you overplan, you overwork, you override God's instructions, not because you're disobedient on purpose, but because you're trying to feel secure. That's exactly what they did in Exodus. God said, take what you need today. But they said, let me get a little bit more just in case for tomorrow. And what happened? It spoiled because it wasn't gathered in obedience. It spoiled. Anything we try to hold outside of God's instructions will not sustain us. Because the issue was never the manna. The issue was, do I trust God enough to do it His way? When you don't trust God's provision, you'll step outside of His process. Let me say that again. When you don't trust God's provisions, you'll step outside of His process. And when you step outside of His process, you end up managing something He never told you to carry. And let's talk about transition to the promised land. In Joshua 5 and 12, let's move back to Joshua. We've been talking about Joshua for a while. So the manna stopped in Joshua. The manna stopped, but God didn't stop providing. He changed how He provided. They went from eating manna to eating the produce of the land. God's provision is consistent, but His methods, they're not always the same. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever, Scripture says. But His methods are seasonal. See, in the wilderness, they had daily miracles, immediate provisions, dependence for survival on Him. In the promised land, sustained resources, it requires stewardship and a responsibility for them increased. They didn't need a miracle anymore. They needed preparation. God is a God of provision, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a part to play in it. Prayer is not a substitute for preparation. Faith is not just belief, it's behavior. Are we still expecting manna in a season where God has already given us the land? Waiting on God to do something He has already provided the resources for? Praying, but not aligning our actions with His instructions? If God says it's enough, why are we trying to create more? In closing, growth in God is not just receiving His provision. It's responding correctly to what He provides. Because provision always comes with instruction. And trust is revealed in how we respond. Take a moment and reflect. What has God already provided that He now requires you to be obedient for? That is where alignment begins. God bless you. See you next week, right here, Tuesday night, for another Bible study with the Deep Call Movement. God bless you.